My husband told me that marrying me was lowering himself, so I destroyed him in silence and took half of everything, until I discovered, 6 months later, that the night of humiliation was the night his father died, and the award I celebrated was a gift that he bought for me. I was right to leave, but the way I left almost destroyed me too. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how I transformed revenge into wisdom, but not without almost losing my humanity in the process. Let me go back to the beginning, because every story of destruction starts with an illusion of perfection. I met Ryan Thompson at a law school graduation party in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was 25, had just gotten my first job as a second-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary School, and was glowing with that feeling of adult life beginning. Ryan was 27, in his final year of law school, and had that kind of confidence that makes you believe he can conquer the world. When he crossed that crowded room just to ask me what I was drinking, I felt something I'd never felt before, that someone really saw me. The first 6 months were like those romantic movies you watch and think, this doesn't exist in real life. Ryan would show up at my classroom with coffee during break time, just because he knew I skipped breakfast. He memorized my students' names and asked about them as if they were important to him too. There was balance. There was mutual consideration. There was that rare feeling that I had found someone who respected me exactly as I was. The marriage proposal came on an absolutely ordinary Saturday morning, and it was exactly why it was perfect. No expensive restaurant or embarrassing flash mob. We were making pancakes in the tiny kitchen of my apartment, and I had flour on my face, and he simply stopped stirring the batter, looked at me, and said, "Emily, I want to make pancakes with you for the rest of my life." Then he pulled a little box from the pocket of his sweatpants. The ring was simple, within his budget, and perfect. I said yes before he even finished asking. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Asheville. My sister Claire was my maid of honor, and she cried through the entire vows. Ryan's mother, Sharon, seemed genuinely happy. At the time, I didn't notice that smile had a layer of condescension, a kind of, how cute, my son is marrying someone so ordinary. Ryan wrote his own vows and promised to be my partner in everything, on good days and bad. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? The first year of marriage was financially difficult, but we were happy in that us-against-the-world way that temporary poverty can create. Ryan was finishing his final year of law school and studying for the bar exam. I worked at Lincoln Elementary during the day and did private tutoring 3 nights a week to help pay the bills. We ate a lot of instant noodles and shared a single streaming subscription. But on Sunday nights, we cooked together. Something more elaborate, a ritual, and that seemed enough. More than enough. It seemed like an investment in a future where things would be easier. When Ryan passed the bar exam, I was prouder of him than he seemed to be of himself. I brought cheap champagne to celebrate and made a cake that collapsed in the middle, but we laughed so hard it hurt. He got a position at a prestigious law firm in downtown Charlotte, Morrison & Associates, and suddenly our life changed. His salary was good, not great yet, but it was enough for us to stop counting every penny. I finally paid off my entire credit card. We moved to a real house, not a tiny apartment. It seemed like we had crossed through the hard part and arrived at happily ever after. But something started to change when his salary increased. It was subtle at first, so subtle I couldn't name what it was. Ryan started working later, which made sense because he was trying to impress the partners. He started wearing more expensive suits, which also made sense because image mattered in his world. But there were other things. The way he started correcting my grammar at dinners with his colleagues. The way he would sigh when I told stories about my 7-year-old students, as if his work was more important, more real, more worthy of attention. I started to adjust. Without anyone asking, I simply started molding myself to fit better into his life. I woke up earlier to prepare his coffee exactly how he liked it. 1 sugar, a splash of cream, perfect temperature. I prepared egg white omelets with chopped vegetables, whole wheat toast. I picked up his clothes from the dry cleaner every Thursday. I managed our house as if it were my second job. And in a way, it was. But I didn't see it as a problem. I saw it as partnership. I took care of our life so he could focus on his career. Dinners with his work colleagues became more frequent, and I was always there, smiling politely while they talked about cases I didn't completely understand. The wife of one of the partners, Margaret, once asked me what I did, and when I said I was a second-grade teacher, she said, "Oh, how sweet," in a tone that made it clear she found my profession adorable the same way you find a puppy adorable. Small, harmless, of no real importance. Ryan didn't defend me. He just smiled and changed the subject. 3 years into the marriage, Ryan started talking about partnership. The word partner became part of his daily vocabulary like a constant prayer. "When I make partner," he would say, not if. The partners at Morrison & Associates were watching him, evaluating, deciding if he had what it took to move up. The pressure was intense, and I saw the weight of it on Ryan. He stopped sleeping properly. He developed that permanent line between his eyebrows of someone who's constantly worried, but the more I did, the less he seemed to notice. The small things that used to matter, the perfect coffee, the always clean house, the dinner always ready, simply became expected. He stopped saying thank you. He stopped asking me how my day was. Conversations became transactional. "Did you pick up my clothes from the dry cleaner? Did you call the accountant?" I became less wife and more unpaid personal assistant, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. That when he made partner, when the pressure decreased, we would go back to being that couple who made pancakes and laughed until it hurt. In October of that 3rd year, something extraordinary happened in my life. I was selected as Teacher of the Year at Lincoln Elementary School. Out of 43 teachers at the school, they chose me. The award came with a modest plaque, a small bonus of $1,500, and public recognition at a district ceremony the following month. When the principal called me into her office and gave me the news, I cried. I cried because after 6 years of pouring my heart into helping 7-year-old children learn to read and write, someone had noticed. Someone had seen that the work I did mattered. I wanted Ryan to see it too. I wanted him to look at me the way he used to look in those first months. So I planned a special dinner to tell him about the award. I spent the entire afternoon preparing everything with meticulous care. Perfectly grilled salmon, exactly how his mother had taught me. Roasted asparagus with olive oil and sea salt. I drove to 3 different stores to find the specific Cabernet he preferred, the one that cost $40 a bottle. I set the table with our wedding china. I lit candles. Everything was perfect. Ryan texted at 5:30 saying he'd be home by 6:30. 6:30 passed. 7, 8. The salmon was losing its perfect texture in the warm oven. The asparagus was wilting. The candles had burned down almost halfway. I sent 2 messages asking if he was okay, if he was still coming home for dinner. No response. By 9 at night, I had moved from worried to resigned. It wasn't the first time Ryan had been hours late without explanation. In the last 6 months, it had become a pattern I kept justifying. He was under tremendous pressure. The partnership review was consuming all his time. Important clients needed attention at unpredictable hours. But deep down, in a part of me I tried to silence. I knew it wasn't about work. It was about respect. Or the lack of it. And when the door finally opened at 9:30, and I saw his face illuminated by the cold light of his phone, without even registering the set table or smelling the dinner or noticing the candles still burning, I realized something that would change everything. For Ryan Thompson, I had become completely invisible. Ryan came in that night like a ghost walking through a house he no longer recognized. He walked straight past the dining room without looking at the table I had spent hours preparing, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone, his fingers moving in that constant typing pattern that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I moved quickly to intercept him before he could disappear into his office, that sacred space where I wasn't welcome unless it was to drop off coffee or pick up forgotten documents. The words came out in a rush, bright and eager in a way that embarrasses me to remember now. "Ryan, I have incredible news. I was chosen as Teacher of the Year. The ceremony is next month at the district and—" He raised one hand without taking his eyes off the phone. That small, dismissive gesture was somehow worse than anything he said afterward. It was the way you silence an interruption during an important phone call. The way you wave off a waitress trying to refill your water glass when you're in the middle of a conversation that actually matters. He stopped in the hallway and finally looked up from the screen, and I saw his face register not interest or pride, but pure irritation that I had delayed him from something he considered more important than this conversation. What he said next came out in that voice he probably used with opposing counsel when delivering bad news. Clinical, precise, completely devoid of warmth. He told me we needed to establish some new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if he had been planning this speech during his drive home, or perhaps for weeks before this moment. "From now on," he said with that sharp lawyer precision, "I will decide when we talk or spend time together. You need to stop chasing me around like a desperate puppy begging for scraps of attention. It's exhausting, and frankly beneath both of us." He paused there, and I watched him loosen his tie with one hand, while the other still held his phone. He hadn't stopped looking at the screen even while telling me this, as if he couldn't spare his full attention even for the task of restructuring our marriage. Then came the part that would replay in my mind during every sleepless night that followed, the words that would define everything that came after. He said he couldn't believe he had lowered himself enough to marry me, that I was never and would never be anywhere near his level. Ryan laid out his logic with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. I was a second-grade teacher making $48,000 a year. He was about to make partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in North Carolina, with a salary that would be at minimum triple mine. We were not equals, he said, and he was tired of pretending we were. The comparison was delivered as fact rather than opinion, as if my worth as a human being could be accurately calculated by comparing our annual incomes and finding me catastrophically insufficient. Then he walked past me into his office and closed the door. The sound of that door clicking shut echoed through our home with terrible finality. I stood there in the hallway between the dining room and his office, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Behind that closed door, I could hear the faint sound of his voice on a phone call, probably with a colleague or client, conducting business that mattered more than the wife he had just demolished. I walked slowly back to the dining room and looked at everything I had prepared. The salmon on our wedding china now cold and congealing, the asparagus that had lost its perfect texture, the expensive wine sitting opened on the table, the candles burning lower in their crystal holders. Everything looked different now, transformed by his words from a celebration into evidence of my foolish hope and fundamental inadequacy. This was what happened when someone making $48,000 a year tried to pretend she deserved recognition, or celebration, or basic respect from someone about to make partner at a prestigious firm. I didn't cry that night. That fact surprised me later when I had time to think about it, because tears would have been the natural response to having your husband tell you that marrying you was an act of lowering himself. But instead of grief or heartbreak, I felt something else arriving uninvited. It was cold and clear and merciless, like water freezing into ice or steel being forged in fire. The man I had married, the man whose last name I carried, the man I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs and taking out loans and sacrificing my own financial security, had just told me I would never be good enough. I stood in that dining room staring at the closed office door, and I made a decision. If Ryan wanted silence, if he wanted to decide when we communicated, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him that our marriage represented him lowering himself, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect compliance that he would eventually realize the catastrophic error he had made. I would respect his boundaries so thoroughly that he would come to understand what his life actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. I moved through the dining room like someone performing a familiar ritual for the last time. I cleared the table and wrapped the uneaten salmon in foil, placing it in the refrigerator where it would sit untouched until I threw it away days later. I blew out the candles and watched the thin streams of smoke rise toward the ceiling. I put away the wedding china piece by piece, wondering if we would ever use it again and already knowing the answer. And I picked up that bottle of $40 Cabernet and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid spiral away, $40 disappearing down the drain as a fitting symbol for the evening and perhaps for our entire marriage. Then I walked upstairs to the guest room and closed that door, creating my own boundary in response to his. Sleep didn't come that night, but planning did. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, and I began to think through what came next with surprising clarity despite the shock still reverberating through my system. Ryan had just handed me something valuable without realizing it. He had given me permission to stop trying, permission to stop walking on eggshells, permission to stop being the only person in our marriage who seemed to care whether it survived. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through our home with new purpose. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only 1 cup. I prepared breakfast, but only enough for 1 person. When Ryan emerged from our bedroom around 7, still adjusting his cufflinks and checking his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked confused. The confusion was brief, but visible. For 3 years, I had made his breakfast every morning without fail. His egg white omelet with precisely chopped vegetables, his whole wheat toast, his coffee prepared exactly how he liked it, with 1 sugar and a splash of cream. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my own simple breakfast, and I looked at him calmly. I told him I assumed he would prefer to handle his own meals going forward, since he was so capable and I was apparently so far beneath his standards that my service was no longer required. The words came out politely, with no trace of anger or sarcasm, and that seemed to confuse him even more than the absence of breakfast. Ryan opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his briefcase from the counter where I normally would have placed it along with his dry cleaning receipt and a reminder about whatever he had asked me to handle that day. None of those things were there now. He stood for a moment looking around the kitchen as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify, then headed toward the door. I watched him leave without offering the goodbye kiss that had once been automatic, without reminding him about his afternoon meeting or asking what time he would be home for dinner. The door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee, feeling the silence settle around me. That silence no longer felt uncomfortable or tense. Instead, it felt full of possibility. It felt like freedom. And in that moment, looking at the closed door where my husband had just left without noticing that everything had changed, I understood something profound. The most powerful revenge wouldn't be yelling or confronting or begging for explanations. It would be simply giving him the silence he demanded, so completely and so perfectly that by the time he finally realized what he had lost, it would be too late to get it back. The first days of my strategic withdrawal were harder than I had anticipated, though not for the reasons I expected. I didn't miss Ryan. I didn't feel lonely or sad or regretful about the decision I had made to give him exactly the silence he demanded. What proved difficult was breaking 3 years of carefully constructed habits that had become as automatic as breathing. My body had learned to operate a certain way, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. I sat at my desk during morning recess while my second graders played outside under the supervision of the playground monitor. My phone lay on the desk beside my lesson planner, and I caught my hand reaching for it without conscious thought. My thumb moved toward the screen to open my messages, muscle memory preparing to type out the usual text, asking Ryan how his morning was going or whether he needed me to pick up anything on my way home. I stopped myself just before touching the screen and pulled my hand back as if the phone had suddenly become hot. This happened again during my planning period, and again while my students were at lunch. Each time I had to actively override the impulse that had been reinforced daily for 3 years. I decided to redirect that energy somewhere else. I picked up my phone and texted my sister Claire instead, asking if she wanted to have dinner sometime that week. We hadn't spent quality time together in months because I always seemed to have something I needed to do for Ryan. Claire responded almost immediately with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points, saying she had been worried about me and would love to catch up. Then I messaged my friend Andrea, who I had been neglecting because Ryan always seemed to need something during the evening hours when I might have maintained friendships. Andrea wrote back saying she thought I had forgotten she existed and suggesting we meet for drinks Friday after work. I even responded to an email from Jenna, the 5th grade teacher down the hall, whose lunch invitations I had declined at least 6 times over the past year because I always rushed home to make sure Ryan had a proper dinner waiting. When I finally walked into the teacher's lounge that afternoon carrying my lunch, Jenna looked up from her salad with genuine surprise. She had been sitting alone at one of the small round tables, grading papers while she ate, and her face brightened when she saw me. I asked if I could join her, and she immediately moved her stack of papers to make room. We talked about nothing particularly important. Jenna told me about the Costa Rica vacation she was planning for spring break, showing me photos on her phone of the Eco Lodge where she had booked a room. She complained about a difficult parent conference she was dreading the following week. I realized as we talked that I had missed this simple conversation with another adult about topics that had nothing to do with managing Ryan's needs, or anticipating his moods, or making sure his life ran smoothly. Jenna asked me how my week was going, and I found myself telling her about my Teacher of the Year award. Her reaction was everything Ryan's should have been. She grabbed my arm and actually squealed with excitement, saying I absolutely deserved the recognition, and that she had always thought I was one of the best teachers in the building. When the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, I felt lighter somehow. By day 3, something shifted in a way I hadn't expected. I woke up that morning and went through my routine of showering and getting dressed and preparing for work, and somewhere around the time I was brushing my teeth, I realized I hadn't thought about Ryan even once. I hadn't wondered what time he would be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule to anticipate what he might need from me. I hadn't checked my phone to see if he had sent any messages overnight. The realization stopped me mid-motion with my toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Ryan wasn't the background program constantly running in my mind. At school that day, I taught my second graders about the water cycle with genuine focus and enthusiasm. We did an experiment with ice cubes and warm water to demonstrate evaporation and condensation, and I found myself fully present in the moment rather than mentally planning what to cook for dinner or worrying about whether I had forgotten something Ryan needed. During recess, I helped settle a dispute between two boys fighting over who got to use the basketball court, and I handled it with patience and humor. I planned the following week's lessons without checking my phone once to see if Ryan had texted. The mental space that had been consumed by managing his requirements was suddenly available for other things. I felt physically lighter, as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to walk without that weight pressing down on my shoulders. During my lunch break with Jenna, I actually tasted my food instead of eating mechanically while part of my brain was already planning dinner. Jenna noticed the change before I fully recognized it myself. She tilted her head while watching me and said I seemed different somehow. Lighter was the word she used. She asked if something good had happened, and I told her I was just making some life adjustments. She didn't push for details, but she smiled at me with the knowing expression of someone who understood that sometimes the best changes come from finally letting go of things that were weighing you down. The transformation accelerated with each passing day, gathering momentum like a stone rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before school, something I had abandoned during my marriage, because Ryan used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. The complaint had never made sense because he left for work before 6 and wouldn't have noticed my absence anyway. But I had stopped going because the criticism made me feel guilty. Now I reclaimed that morning routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30 and spent 45 minutes on the treadmill and weight machines, and I arrived at school feeling energized rather than drained. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift away over the past 3 years. Andrea and I met for drinks on a Friday evening at a wine bar downtown, and we talked for 3 hours without me checking my phone once to see if Ryan needed anything. My college friend Melissa invited me to a weekend brunch, and I accepted without the automatic calculation of whether Ryan might want me around that day. These friendships had been neglected because Ryan always seemed to need something during the hours I might have spent maintaining connections outside our marriage. On Wednesday evening of that second week, I did something I had wanted to do for years. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The class met every Wednesday from 6 to 8, time I would normally have spent preparing elaborate dinners that Ryan barely acknowledged. I walked into the studio feeling nervous and excited, and I was greeted by Margaret, the instructor. She looked to be in her mid-60s with short silver hair and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. She had the kind of face that suggested she had lived through difficult things and emerged stronger. Margaret welcomed me with genuine warmth and showed me to a pottery wheel in the corner. She demonstrated how to center clay on the wheel, her hands moving with practiced confidence. I tried to copy her movements, but my first attempt was a disaster that collapsed into a misshapen lump within seconds. Margaret laughed kindly and told me everyone started there. She said learning pottery required patience and willingness to fail repeatedly before anything good emerged. Then she shared something personal. She had been teaching pottery for 20 years, she said. After her second divorce forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She had needed something that was entirely hers, she told me. Something nobody could criticize or diminish or take away. Pottery became that thing for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I had said, and she told me that sometimes the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted. Her words settled over me like a blessing. I worked the clay for the rest of that class, and while nothing I made was remotely presentable, I felt something shift inside me. I was building something new from the ruins of my marriage, and it would be entirely mine. On day 7, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town where Ryan would never have reason to go. I walked into the building with my heart pounding and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. The banker who helped me was a young woman who looked fresh out of college. She walked me through the paperwork with professional efficiency, never asking why I wanted an account separate from any joint finances. I opened a checking account in only my name and authorized the bank to set up automatic transfers from my paycheck, small amounts that Ryan would never notice missing, building a financial safety net that existed entirely outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I found Patricia Reeves through an online search for lawyers specializing in high-asset divorces where one spouse had significantly higher income. Her office was downtown in a high-rise building that smelled like expensive leather and quiet power. Patricia listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator calculating exactly how much my husband was going to pay for his arrogance. She took notes in precise handwriting and asked detailed questions. She wanted to know about our finances, about the student loans I had taken out to support us through Ryan's law school years, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he studied for the bar exam. Patricia told me that in our state, his upcoming partnership and the significant salary increase that came with it would be considered marital property subject to division, especially since I had financially supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this information, it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Ryan regret every cruel word he had said to me. I left her office with a plan and a timeline, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something like hope. The changes in Ryan became visible around day 10. Subtle at first, but accumulating into something I could no longer ignore even if I wanted to. I started noticing things during those brief moments when our paths crossed in the house we still technically shared. He would emerge from the bedroom in the morning looking disoriented, moving through the kitchen with the confused energy of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. I could hear him opening cabinets and closing them again, the sounds punctuated by long pauses that suggested he was trying to remember where things were supposed to be, or perhaps wondering why they were no longer where he expected them. His favorite coffee mug sat unused in the cabinet. For 3 years, that mug had been waiting for him every morning, filled with coffee prepared exactly how he liked it. 1 sugar and a splash of cream, the temperature still hot but not scalding. Now it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made only enough coffee for myself. I would stand at the counter preparing my breakfast and watch him in my peripheral vision as he opened the cabinet, saw the empty mug, and closed the cabinet again without taking it out. He never asked me to make his coffee. He never even mentioned the absence of this routine we had maintained for so long. But I could see the confusion in his posture, the way he stood there for a few extra seconds, as if waiting for something to materialize that no longer would. The dry cleaning situation provided another source of visible bewilderment. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his dress shirts and suits from the dry cleaner on my way home from school. The timing worked perfectly because the cleaner was between my school and our house, and Ryan always had evening meetings or court appearances that required freshly pressed clothing. Now his dress shirts hung in the cleaner's storage area with yellow tickets attached, unclaimed because I no longer considered his wardrobe maintenance part of my responsibilities. On Thursday evening of the second week, I heard him on the phone with the dry cleaner, his voice carrying irritation, mixed with confusion about why his clothes hadn't been picked up as usual. The kitchen told its own story of deterioration. The groceries I used to purchase and organize according to his preferences were gone, replaced by items I wanted to eat without any regard for his tastes. I bought the snacks I liked, the breakfast foods that were easy to prepare for one person, the ingredients for simple meals I could make quickly after work. Ryan would open the refrigerator and stand there staring at the contents, as if the items inside were written in a language he couldn't read. He was looking for the prepared meals I used to have waiting, the ingredients for his favorite dishes, the specific brand of yogurt he preferred. None of it was there anymore. And when I finally received that email 3 weeks later, requesting an urgent meeting at school, I realized that my perfect plan of silent revenge was about to collide with a truth that would destroy everything I thought I knew. The email arrived on a Monday morning while I was having coffee in my quiet apartment, savoring those peaceful minutes before heading to school. The subject line said, "Urgent Meeting, Monday 9 a.m., and it came from the Human Resources Department at Lincoln Elementary. My stomach tightened instantly. In 6 years of teaching, I had never received an email from HR requesting an urgent meeting. I reread the message 3 times, searching for clues about what it could be, but the text was frustratingly vague. Please come to the HR office Monday at 9 in the morning to discuss a sensitive matter related to your Teacher of the Year award. I spent the entire weekend in growing anxiety, my mind creating increasingly catastrophic scenarios. Had someone contested my selection? Was there some procedural irregularity? Had a parent complained about something? I barely slept Sunday night, lying awake staring at the ceiling of the guest room that had become my sanctuary, wondering what possible sensitive matter could be waiting for me. When Monday morning finally came, I arrived at school 30 minutes early, my stomach churning with nervousness. Principal Dr. Wilson was waiting in the HR office along with Janet from Human Resources. Both had those carefully neutral expressions that people trained in delicate situations wear when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. Dr. Wilson indicated a chair and waited until I sat before speaking. Her voice was gentle but firm when she said, "Emily, there has been a mistake. The Teacher of the Year award was based on colleague nominations and performance evaluations, but when reviewing the process, we discovered irregularities that we need to address." My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Irregularities. The word hung in the air between us like something toxic. Janet from HR opened a folder on the table and slid a document in my direction. It was a record of a donation to the school, dated 6 months earlier, long before that terrible Tuesday night when Ryan had told me that marrying me was lowering himself. The donation was for $50,000, made anonymously through a lawyer's trust fund. But the paperwork revealed the actual donor, Ryan Michael Thompson. The words came out of Dr. Wilson's mouth as if they were moving through water. The donation came with a specific condition. The donor requested that the funds be used for academic programs, but also strongly suggested that you should be recognized for your exceptional contributions to the faculty. It wasn't explicitly a purchase, but the implication was clear enough that we felt obligated to review the selection process. She paused, letting that information settle. Emily, I want to make it clear that you are an excellent teacher, and you deserve recognition, but we can't let this award stand knowing it was influenced by a conditional donation. I sat in that chair, unable to fully process what I was hearing. Ryan had bought the award for me. The recognition that had made me feel seen and valued for the first time in years, the achievement that had sparked my elaborate revenge, had been a gift from him. He had donated $50,000 to my school, an amount of money that was significant even for a successful lawyer, and conditioned the donation on me winning recognition. He had done this 6 months before the night of humiliation, when he was still trying to make me feel special, when he was still trying to compensate in ways I hadn't recognized. I heard my own voice as if it was coming from very far away, asking exactly when Ryan had made this donation. Janet checked the paperwork and confirmed, early April, 7 months ago. I did the math quickly in my head. At that time, Ryan was in the middle of the most intense professional pressure of his life, working 70 hours a week, rarely home, clearly struggling with something I had interpreted as disinterest in me. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, he had arranged a massive donation to my school specifically structured to give me the recognition he knew I craved. Dr. Wilson continued talking, explaining that the school would be returning Ryan's donation and reversing the Teacher of the Year award, but I could barely hear her through the noise in my head. The entire foundation of my revenge, the night when he came home too late for my special dinner, when he dismissed my excitement about an award that he had secretly arranged for me to win, suddenly looked different. Not justifiable, not excusable, but different in a way that made me feel sick. I left that meeting reeling, my mind spinning. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had really happened that Tuesday night in October. I drove straight to Ryan's sister's house, Melissa, without even calling first. When she opened the door and saw my face, something in her expression changed, as if she knew this moment was coming and had dreaded it. I demanded to know the truth about that night. The whole truth. Not the sanitized version Ryan had tried to tell me through desperate messages I had deleted without reading. Melissa let me in, and we sat in her living room, and what she told me over the next 2 hours completely destroyed the narrative I had so carefully constructed. On that Tuesday in October, at 3 p.m, Ryan received a call from the hospital. His father, Robert Thompson, had suffered a severe stroke. Massive and catastrophic, the doctors said. There was nothing they could do except make him comfortable. He had hours, maybe days, but probably wouldn't make it through the night. Ryan dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, where he spent the next 6.5 hours watching his father die. At 6:30, when Ryan sent that message saying he'd be home at that time, he was still at the hospital by his father's bedside, watching the monitors show declining vital signs. He lied to me about when he'd be home because he didn't want to ruin my special night. He didn't want my celebration to be contaminated by his father's death, so he sent that cheerful message promising he'd make it to dinner, even knowing he wouldn't, hoping that somehow he could process his trauma alone and still show up for me. Robert Thompson died at 8:45 in the evening. Ryan was holding his father's hand when he took his last breath. Then Ryan had to sit in a hospital administrator's office signing paperwork, authorizing the funeral home to pick up the body, making decisions about funeral arrangements while still in profound shock. He finally left the hospital at 9:15 and drove straight home, where I was waiting with my special dinner and my excitement about an award he had secretly bought for me 6 months earlier. When he walked through that door at 9:30, it hadn't been 3 hours late from disrespect or neglect. It had been 6.5 hours watching his father die. Melissa continued, her voice breaking as she told the rest. When I intercepted Ryan in the hallway with my excited story about being Teacher of the Year, the award he had arranged as a surprise gift, he was operating purely on survival instinct. He had just lost his father. He was in severe shock. And when I started talking about the award with such joy, something in him just broke. The cruel irony of it all, that he had secretly bought that recognition for me months before, and now was hearing about it on the worst night of his life, was too much for his traumatized brain to process. The horrible words he said, that he couldn't believe he had lowered himself to marry me, that I would never be on his level, didn't come from a place of calculated cruelty or arrogance developed over time. They came from a man in absolute collapse who had spent hours watching his father die, who was operating in pure trauma, who no longer had the capacity to filter or control what came out of his mouth. Melissa told me that Ryan called her at 10 that night, after I had gone to the guest room, crying so hard she could barely understand what he was saying. He had told Melissa everything, that his father had died, that he had said monstrous things to me, that he had destroyed our marriage on the worst night of his life. Melissa begged him to tell me about his father's death in the morning, to explain the context of his words, but Ryan refused. He said the words had come out of his mouth, that there was no excuse for that cruelty, that I deserved to hate him. He decided to accept being the villain because he felt he deserved to be punished for saying those things, regardless of what mental state he was in when he said them. I sat in Melissa's living room feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about that night was wrong. The arrogant, cruel husband I had built in my head wasn't who Ryan really was in that moment. He was a man in unimaginable trauma who had said horrible things while operating in pure shock, and then had refused to defend himself because he thought he deserved my anger. And I had responded with 2 months of calculated silence, refusing every attempt he made to explain, building a legal case against him, systematically planning to destroy his life. Melissa then told me about the messages Ryan had tried to send me during those 2 months of silence. The messages I had deleted without reading, so committed to my perfect revenge that I refused to consider there might be context I was missing. The first message, sent the day after that terrible night. Emily, please, I need to explain about that night. My father died. I was in shock. It's no excuse for what I said, but please let me explain. I deleted it without reading. The second message, a week later. I'm in the hospital. I think I'm having a nervous breakdown. You're the only person I want to talk to. The third message, 2 weeks later. I bought the award for you 6 months ago. I wanted you to feel like you were seen. I always saw you. I failed to show it, but I saw you. Each message was an attempt to reach me, to give me the context that would explain that night, to tell me he was falling apart and needed help. And I had deleted each one without reading, so convinced of my own righteousness, so committed to my silent and calculated revenge. Melissa looked at me with tears in her eyes and said something that would echo in my mind for months. Emily, you weren't wrong to feel pain from his words, but you were wrong to refuse to listen when he tried to explain that he was dying inside. I left Melissa's house and drove aimlessly for hours, my mind unable to settle on any coherent thought. I had destroyed a man who was sick, not cruel. I had taken my justifiable pain and used it as a weapon against someone who was drowning and trying to ask for help. Ryan had said horrible things. That was true. Trauma isn't a free pass for cruelty. That was also true. But I had taken that moment of his collapse and used it to build an entire narrative where I was the righteous heroine and he was the arrogant villain, when the reality was infinitely more complicated. That night, I sat alone in the guest room that had become my refuge and forced myself to face the whole truth. My marriage had problems before that terrible night. That was real. Ryan had become distant and inattentive. That was also real. But that specific night, the event that had triggered my elaborate revenge, had happened because my husband was experiencing the worst trauma of his life and had no emotional tools to deal with it. And when he tried to reach out afterward, when he tried to explain, when he begged for a chance to contextualize those cruel words, I silenced him completely. I looked at my phone and, for the first time in 2 months, truly considered what I had done. I had ignored calls from a man in crisis. I had deleted messages without reading. I had moved into an apartment without giving him a chance to explain. I had hired a divorce lawyer and started building a legal case against him. I had deliberately turned his breakdown into my opportunity for victory. And the worst part, the part that made me feel physically sick, was that I had felt proud of my cold and calculated strategy. I had congratulated myself for not being emotional, for being tactical, for executing my exit with the precision of a general planning war. But what I had really done was use the tools of emotional abuse, silencing, denial of context, refusal of communication, against someone who was emotionally dying and begging for help. As I sat in that room feeling the walls of my righteous justification crumble around me, I realized I had become exactly the kind of person I thought I was escaping, and that realization destroyed me in ways that Ryan's original cruelty never could have. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every decision I had made over the past 2 months, every message I had deleted without reading, every call I had refused. The woman who had felt so justified in her silent revenge now seemed like a stranger to me, someone capable of a cold cruelty I hadn't realized I possessed. Around 3 in the morning, I picked up my phone and did something I had avoided for weeks. I opened my deleted message history, that digital graveyard of communications I had judged unworthy of reading. One by one, I read the messages Ryan had sent during those 2 months of silence. Messages that started desperate and gradually became resigned. Emily, please, just give me 5 minutes to explain that night. My therapist says I'm having a severe nervous breakdown. I know I have no right to ask for your help, but you're the only person I trust. I understand if you can never forgive me, but please know that night was the worst of my life in multiple ways, and I wish I could go back and do everything differently. The firm put my partnership review on hold. They said I need to focus on getting healthy first. You were right about me valuing the wrong things. The last messages, sent well after I had changed my phone number and blocked him on all platforms, were the hardest to read. I signed the divorce papers. You deserve more than I gave. I just wanted you to know I'm going to do serious therapy, not because I think I can get you back, but because I don't want to be the person I was that night ever again. Each message was a piece of evidence I had deliberately ignored, so committed to my narrative of righteous victim that I refused to consider the story might be more complicated than villain and heroine. The next morning, I called out of work and said I was sick. It was the first time in 6 years I had missed without actually having the flu or something worse. I spent the entire day in emergency therapy with a counselor my friend Andrea had recommended months ago, but that I had dismissed because I thought I didn't need therapy. I needed divorce. Sitting in that sterile office, I told the entire story to a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who listened without judgment while I broke down over the mess I had made of my life and Ryan's marriage. Dr. Chen let me cry for 20 full minutes before speaking. When she finally spoke, what she said wasn't what I expected. She told me that both things could be true simultaneously. Ryan had said immensely cruel things that hurt me deeply, and Ryan was going through severe trauma when he said those things. I had the right to feel devastated by those words, and I had responsibility for how I chose to respond. His pain didn't cancel out my pain, but my pain didn't give me license to inflict more damage on someone who was clearly in crisis. She asked me what I really wanted now, knowing everything I knew, not what I thought I should want, not what would be easiest to explain to friends and family, but what I wanted deep down when I removed all the layers of wounded pride and justified revenge. The answer came out before I could censor it. I want to understand what really happened. I want him to know that I know now about his father's death. I want him to know I'm sorry for silencing him when he was begging for help. Dr. Chen nodded and then asked the hardest question. And the marriage? What do you want to do about that? That question stopped me completely, because the truth was complicated in ways I wasn't ready to articulate. My marriage had real problems before that terrible night. Ryan had become emotionally distant. I had started to feel invisible. We had stopped communicating in meaningful ways long before everything exploded. His father's death and the subsequent breakdown hadn't created those problems. They had just revealed how fragile our foundation already was. But it was also true that I had responded to those problems in the worst possible way, with strategic silence and calculated revenge instead of honest communication. Dr. Chen gave me an assignment before I left that first session. Write 2 letters. One to Ryan, saying everything I needed to say now that I knew the complete truth, and one to myself, from the perspective of 6 months in the future, describing where I wanted to be and what kind of person I wanted to have become. She didn't ask me to send the letter to Ryan, just to write it, to put into words what was spinning in my head in infinite circles. I spent that entire night writing, tearing up pages, starting over, trying to find language for the complicated mess of regret and anger and sadness and guilt. The letter to Ryan went through 12 drafts before I got something that felt honest. Ryan, I know now about your father's death. I know that night was the worst of your life in ways I didn't understand when I silenced you for 2 months. I'm sorry for deleting your messages without reading them. I'm sorry for refusing to listen when you were begging for a chance to explain. The words you said hurt me deeply. They still hurt. But now I understand they came from a place of unimaginable trauma, not calculated arrogance. And I understand that when you most needed me, I turned your collapse into my opportunity for revenge. But I also wrote about the harder truth. Our marriage was dying before that night. We both know that. even if neither of us wanted to admit it. You had become distant in ways that made me feel invisible. I had started building a separate life because I stopped feeling like I was a partner in ours. That terrible night didn't create those problems. It just forced both of us to confront them in the worst possible way. I still think separating is the right choice, but the way I chose to leave, silent, calculated, refusing all communication, was cruel in ways that make me question who I became. The letter to my future self was harder because it required imagining a version of me who had processed all of this and emerged whole instead of broken. Dear Emily, 6 months from now, I wrote, I hope you've learned that being right about needing to leave didn't make you right about how you left. I hope you've made peace with complexity, that you were hurt and caused hurt, that you were victim and perpetrator, that relationships rarely have a clear villain. I hope you found a way to use all this pain as a teacher instead of a weapon. In the days that followed, I made practical decisions that felt simultaneously impossible and necessary. First, I called Patricia, my divorce lawyer, and told her I needed to pause proceedings immediately. She wasn't happy. Divorce lawyers rarely are when clients start having second thoughts in the middle of a case that's going well. But when I explained that I had discovered new context about that night, that my husband had just watched his father die when he said those cruel things, even Patricia had to admit it changed calculations. She warned me, however, about something I hadn't fully considered. She had suppressed evidence that would humanize Ryan during our initial proceedings. She knew about the father's death from the beginning. It was in public records, had come up in the basic background research every divorce lawyer does. She knew about the nervous breakdown, about the hospitalizations, about the medical leave from work. And she had deliberately kept all that information out of our case because it made Ryan sympathetic, and successful divorce lawyers don't build cases around sympathetic defendants. It's my job to win, not seek truth, Patricia told me with the brutal frankness I had admired when I hired her. You paid me to destroy him. I was destroying him. If you wanted couples therapy, you should have hired a therapist. Her words hit me like a physical slap because she was absolutely right. I hadn't hired Patricia to help save my marriage or facilitate healthy communication or find compassionate resolution. I had hired her for war, and she had given me exactly what I asked for. Next, I went to the bank and closed the secret account I had opened so carefully. The automatic transfers from my paycheck had accumulated a few $1,000s over 2 months, money I had hidden as a safety cushion, but that now looked like evidence of how much I had premeditated this entire exit strategy. The teller who helped me close the account asked if I was sure, and I said yes, though honestly I wasn't sure of anything at that moment except that I needed to stop operating from a place of deception and start operating from a place of honesty. No matter how scary that was. The hardest part was what I knew I had to do next. I needed to talk to Ryan. Not through lawyers or text messages or intermediaries, but face to face, honestly, about everything that had happened. The idea terrified me in ways I could barely articulate. What do you say to someone you systematically silenced while they were having a nervous breakdown? How do you start that conversation? Dr. Chen helped me practice in therapy, role-playing different scenarios, preparing for the possibility that Ryan could be justifiably furious with me, or too hurt to talk, or so far along in his own healing process that he didn't want to reopen these wounds. I sent a message to Melissa asking for help. I explained that I needed to talk to Ryan, that I knew now about everything, the father's death, the nervous breakdown, the bought award, the deleted messages, and that I needed to have an honest conversation about all of it. Melissa responded 4 hours later, and her message made me pause. Emily, he's willing to talk to you, but you need to know, he's not the same person you remember. He's been in intensive therapy for 2 months. He's lost almost 20 pounds. He looks like a ghost version of himself. I don't know if he wants reconciliation or closure, but he deserves honesty now, not more strategic games. We agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop, not too far from downtown, but not anywhere that carried memories of ours. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed and undressed 3 times, unable to decide what you wear to a meeting like this. Finally, I chose simple clothes, jeans and a blouse, nothing that signaled an attempt to impress or manipulate. I arrived 15 minutes early and grabbed a table in the corner, my hands shaking as I waited. And when Ryan finally walked through that door, I barely recognized him, and I realized that the last 2 months had destroyed him in ways I never imagined when I was so busy feeling righteous about my silent revenge. Ryan came into that coffee shop looking like someone who had survived something that should have killed him. Melissa was right. He had lost significant weight, not the healthy kind that comes from exercise, but the unsettling kind that comes from forgetting to eat because your body is operating in pure survival mode. His suit, which used to fit perfectly, now hung on his shoulders. The dark circles under his eyes were so pronounced they looked like bruises. But what shocked me most was the way he moved. Slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned that fast movements caused pain. He saw me and hesitated for a moment at the door, as if he was considering whether he could still leave. Then he crossed the coffee shop and sat in the chair across from me, keeping the table between us like a necessary buffer. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. I had practiced an opening speech with Dr. Chen, carefully chosen words that would acknowledge both my pain and his. But looking at him now, all those prepared words evaporated. What came out was simple and raw. Melissa told me about your father, and about the award, and about the messages I deleted without reading. Ryan nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the outline of the coffee cup in front of him. He hadn't drunk from it yet, just held it as if the warmth was an anchor keeping him present. I should have told you about my dad the next morning, he said, and his voice was hoarse in a way that suggested he hadn't used it much recently. Melissa begged me to explain, but I was so ashamed of what I said to you. The words that came out of my mouth that night, Emily, they came from me. Trauma isn't an excuse for cruelty. I hurt you in ways that have no justification, no matter what I was going through. I watched him force himself to look me in the eyes for the first time, and I saw something there that broke me. Not anger, not hatred, but a kind of resigned sadness of someone who had completely accepted his guilt. When you silenced me afterward, he continued, when you stopped answering my calls, when you deleted my messages without reading them, when you disappeared, part of me thought it was what I deserved. I had said you would never be on my level. So you proved I was wrong in the worst possible way. You operated at a level of strategic control I didn't even know you possessed. His words hit me physically. I had spent 2 months feeling proud of that strategic control, that cold and calculated execution of my exit. Now, hearing him describe it, it sounded exactly like what it was. Cruelty wrapped in righteousness. Ryan, I said, my voice breaking, I didn't know about your father. If I had known, if I had read just one of your messages, if I had given you 5 minutes to explain, he interrupted me gently. You didn't know because I didn't tell you that night. And you didn't read the messages because I had hurt you so badly that you didn't owe me anything, not even your attention. We sat in silence for a long moment, both acknowledging the complex truth. He had hurt me terribly while in trauma, and I had responded to his hurt with strategic silencing that hurt him terribly while he was in crisis. Neither of those things canceled out the other. Both could be true. Marriage, I was beginning to understand, rarely has clear villains, just hurt people making bad choices in their worst moments. The firm put my partnership review on indefinite hold, Ryan said eventually, shifting the subject slightly. They said I need to demonstrate sustained personal stability before they'll consider promoting me. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. The irony isn't lost on me. I used my impending professional success as a weapon against you, as proof you weren't on my level. Now that success has evaporated because I collapsed under the pressure of chasing it. Turns out dedicating every part of yourself to impressing people who don't care about you as a human is a great recipe for nervous breakdown when life throws real trauma at you. He paused, his fingers still tracing that obsessive pattern on the coffee cup. My therapist says I was running from problems in our marriage by burying myself in work, that I turned partnership into an idol because it was easier than confronting how disconnected I'd become from you. I heard him articulate things I had felt but never named, and I realized we had both been guilty of running instead of confronting. I had run into my second graders, pouring emotional energy into 7-year-olds because it was safer than risking vulnerability with my husband. He had run into his pursuit of partnership, using professional ambition as a shield against emotional intimacy. And when trauma forced everything to the surface that terrible Tuesday night, neither of us had tools to deal with it healthily. I should have said no when you silenced me, Ryan said suddenly, his voice getting stronger. I should have shown up at school, at Claire's house, anywhere you were, and forced you to hear about my dad. But I was so broken, Emily. So completely broken. My father died. My marriage died on the same night. My career was crumbling because I couldn't function. I ended up in the hospital twice. Once because I stopped eating entirely for 5 days. Another time because I had what the doctors called a severe panic attack, but at the time I was certain was a heart attack. He finally took a sip of the coffee, and I saw his hands trembling slightly. I read books about emotional abuse while I was in the hospital, he continued. not looking at me now, trying to understand what had happened between us. And you know what's confusing? We had both been abusive in different ways. I had been emotionally neglectful for months before that night. I had made you feel invisible, unimportant. I had prioritized everything except you. Then I said immensely cruel things on a night when my brain wasn't functioning properly, and you responded with 2 months of calculated silencing, refusing any communication, using my pain as a strategic tool. His words should have made me feel defensive, but they didn't. They just made me feel tired. Tired of trying to figure out who was more wrong, who hurt more, who deserved more sympathy. Ryan, I said finally, I think our marriage was dying well before that night. I think we both knew it, but were too busy pretending everything would be fine once things got less stressful. But things never get less stressful. Life always throws something at you. And we didn't have a strong enough foundation to survive real impact. He nodded, and I saw relief on his face that I had said out loud what we were both thinking. So what do we do now? He asked. Because honestly, Emily, I don't know. Part of me still loves you. Part of me always will love you. The person who worked 2 jobs to support me through law school, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who made pancakes with me on Saturday mornings. But I also don't trust us together. We brought out the worst in each other under pressure. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering when the next breakdown will happen. That brutal honesty was what I needed to hear. Not because it made the decision easier, but because it made it real. I think we're done, I said, and the words came softer than I expected. Not in the angry, vengeful way I was planning, but in the sad and necessary way when 2 people who once loved each other realize they're not good for each other, no matter how much they try to be. Ryan nodded slowly, and I saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. But I need you to know some things before we're really done. I took a deep breath and forced myself to say the hardest words I'd ever said. I'm sorry for silencing you when you were begging for help. I'm sorry for deleting your messages without reading them. I'm sorry for using your nervous breakdown as a strategic weapon. The words you said hurt me deeply, they still hurt. But my response to that hurt was disproportionately cruel. I turned your worst night into my opportunity, and that makes me someone I don't want to be. The tears were running down my face now, but I continued. And I need to return half the money from the divorce settlement. Ryan looked genuinely confused by that. Emily, that money is legally yours. You supported me through law school. You're entitled. I cut him off. It doesn't matter what's legally mine. It matters what's morally right. You don't owe me massive compensation for having a nervous breakdown. You don't owe me financial punishment for saying cruel things while your father was dying. Our marriage ended. That's consequence enough for both of us. I had calculated the numbers with Patricia before coming. Half the settlement would be $150,000. A significant amount, but returning it felt like the only path to starting to live with some kind of integrity. Ryan watched me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You're really doing this? He asked. You're really giving up money that could pay off your student loans completely? The loans you took out to support me? I nodded. I took out those loans because I was investing in our future, not extorting you for future compensation. If I take that money now, knowing what I know about that night, I'm just perpetuating the cycle of hurt. And I'm tired of hurting, Ryan. I'm so tired. We sat in that coffee shop for 3 more hours, talking about everything that had happened over the past 3 years with the honesty we should have brought to our marriage when there was still a chance to save it. Ryan told me about the brutal pressure at work, about how he had developed severe insomnia months before everything exploded, about how he had stopped recognizing himself in the mirror. I told him about feeling invisible, about pouring emotional energy into my students because I felt more appreciated by 7-year-olds than by my husband, about the loneliness of living with someone who had stopped really seeing me. And somewhere in the middle of that brutally honest conversation, something changed. The anger and resentment that had filled the space between us began to dissolve, replaced by something softer. Not romantic love, not anymore, but a kind of sad tenderness for 2 people who had genuinely tried and genuinely failed. When we finally stood up to leave, Ryan hugged me, and I hugged him back, and we both cried in the middle of that coffee shop while strangers politely pretended not to notice. Take care of yourself, I whispered against his shoulder. Really take care of yourself. Do the therapy, eat regular meals, learn to say no at work. You deserve to be more than just your professional productivity. He pulled back and held my face in his hands, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the man who had crossed that room at the graduation party to ask me what I was drinking. And I realized that man was still there somewhere under all the trauma and collapse, just waiting for permission to heal without someone using his pain as a weapon against him. 18 months after that conversation in the coffee shop, I was sitting in my small therapy office in Charlotte, listening to a woman named Jennifer tell me a story that sounded painfully familiar. Her husband had said cruel things during an argument. He had humiliated her in front of friends. She had a lawyer. She had a plan. She was going to systematically destroy him, and the way she described her strategy with that tone of satisfied righteousness made me see my own reflection from 18 months ago. I let her finish, then took a deep breath and said something therapists probably aren't supposed to say. Before you do that, give me a month. Just 1 month. Let me tell you a story about a teacher who did exactly what you're planning and what she discovered afterward. Those 18 months had transformed me in ways I never could have predicted in that terrible October when everything exploded. After the conversation with Ryan, I had enrolled in a master's program in marriage and family therapy at UNC Charlotte, attending evening classes while still teaching during the day. The decision had surprised everyone, including myself. But the more I processed my own failed marriage in therapy with Dr. Chen, the more I realized I wanted to help other couples before they got to where Ryan and I had gotten. That point of no return, where the hurt had accumulated so much that all that remained was war. The journey hadn't been linear or easy. I had days where I felt at peace with everything that had happened, and days where I woke up at 3 a.m. reliving every cruel decision I had made during those 2 months of strategic silence. Dr. Chen helped me understand that both could coexist. Peace about having left a marriage that was dying, and regret about the methods I had used to leave. I didn't have to choose between I was completely right and I was completely wrong. Human reality is rarely that binary. I returned $150,000 to Ryan through Patricia, who thought I had lost my mind. You're giving up money that would pay off your student loans completely, she had warned me. Money you have legal right to. But legal right and moral integrity are sometimes different things, and I had learned the hard way that you can win a legal battle and still lose some essential part of yourself in the process. Ryan had initially tried to refuse the money, but I insisted. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about me being able to look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Without that massive financial cushion, my life looked different from what I had imagined during my revenge planning days. I still had student loans, now increased by the master's degree I was pursuing. I still drove the same old car I'd driven for 6 years. My apartment was small and modest, not the charming downtown loft I had fantasized about. But there was something about earning these things through my own work, without them being tainted by having been extracted from someone during the worst breakdown of his life, that made everything feel cleaner somehow. More honest. More mine. Ryan and I had established what Dr. Chen called amicable peace. Not friends, not exactly, but not enemies anymore either. We exchanged occasional messages about birthday dates of family members who still mattered to both of us, or when we needed to finalize some persistent legal detail from the divorce. Through Melissa, I learned that Ryan had moved to a smaller, less prestigious firm, where the focus was on public interest law instead of corporate law. He had become a mentor to young lawyers struggling with mental health, using his own breakdown as a teaching tool about the dangers of sacrificing everything for professional ambition. My sister Claire had become one of my closest confidants during the entire healing process. Our weekly phone conversations and Sunday brunches had evolved from superficial to deeply honest. She had confronted me at certain points. Emily, you can't keep punishing yourself forever for what you did. But she had also held me while I cried about who I had become during those 2 months of cold revenge. Claire understood something it took time for me to internalize. You can acknowledge you did something wrong without defining yourself forever by that mistake. Andrea, my friend who had witnessed both the collapse and the reconstruction, told me once over drinks, "You know what's remarkable about you, Em? You actually changed. Most people go through life doubling down on their worst instincts, justifying every cruel action as necessary or deserved. You looked at what you did, were horrified by it, and then actively became a different person. That's rare." Her words had made me cry right there in the bar because I was still learning to accept that growth doesn't erase past mistakes. It just proves you're capable of evolving beyond them. The therapy work I did now was different from teaching in some fundamental way. With my second graders, I had control. I could structure their experiences, guide them through lessons, protect them from certain hurts. With therapy clients, all I could do was sit with them in their mess and help them find their own paths through. I specialized in crisis communication and conflict resolution, specifically helping couples navigate moments of trauma without destroying each other in the process. Every client who walked into my office carrying their own version of pain and anger gave me a chance to do differently than I had done. Jennifer, the woman sitting in my office that day, reminded me so much of myself it hurt. She had the same burning righteousness, the same carefully constructed strategy, the same absolute certainty that revenge would bring her peace. I spent our session not trying to convince her to stay in a marriage that might be genuinely toxic. Sometimes leaving is absolutely the right choice, but asking her to at least fully understand the situation before executing a destruction campaign she couldn't undo. What if there's context you're missing? I asked. What if his cruel words came from a place you don't completely understand yet? Over the next 6 months, Jennifer did end up leaving her husband, but she did it through honest mediation instead of legal war, through difficult conversations instead of strategic silence. She thanked me afterward, saying my story had given her permission to be angry and compassionate simultaneously, to protect herself and still recognize his humanity. Watching her navigate her divorce with more grace than I had navigated mine felt like some kind of redemption, as if I could transform my own mistakes into wisdom that prevented others from repeating them. I had left teaching completely by the end of that first year, a decision that had broken me in ways I didn't expect. I loved my students, genuinely loved them, but Dr. Chen had helped me see that I had been using teaching as a form of emotional escape, pouring into 7-year-olds the energy I should have saved for adult relationships. My students never disappointed me the way adults disappointed, never questioned my worth, never made me feel invisible. They were safe in ways intimate relationships never were. But safety isn't always growth, and I needed to learn to navigate the risky territory of adult human connection if I really wanted to heal. The plaque on my office door said, Emily Carter, MFT, specializing in crisis communication and conflict resolution, and every time I passed it, I still got a strange feeling. Not pride, exactly, but something closer to quiet gratitude that I had found purpose emerging from destruction. The people who sought me out were often those on the precipice of the same mistake I had made. So hurt, they wanted to hurt back. So certain of their righteousness, they had stopped considering complexity. My job was to sit with them in that difficult space and ask, what if both things are true? What if you were hurt and your partner is struggling? What if leaving is necessary and the way you leave still matters? About a year into starting my therapy practice, I received an unexpected email from Ryan. The subject line simply said, "Thank you." And when I opened it, I found a short message. Emily, I heard through Melissa about the work you're doing now, helping couples navigate crisis without destroying each other. I just wanted you to know, I think you transformed the worst thing we ever lived through into something that helps others. That's more than I've managed to do with my own breakdown. You don't owe me anything, but somehow you still found a way to transform our mess into something meaningful. That's remarkable. R. I reread that email 12 times, tears running down my face, because it contained something I didn't know I needed. Forgiveness. Not just from him to me, but some kind of mutual recognition that we had both survived something terrible and were both trying, in our own ways, to make something constructive from the rubble. I didn't respond immediately. I let the words sit with me for a few days, rolling around in my mind, allowing myself to feel both the pain of what we had lost and the gratitude for where we had both arrived. When I finally responded, I kept it simple. Ryan, we both transformed our destruction into something useful. You're helping young lawyers understand that breaking down doesn't mean failing permanently. I'm helping couples communicate through crisis. Neither of us has to carry the worst moment of our life as our permanent identity. Thank you for letting me know you're okay. That matters more than you know. E. And that, I realized after hitting send, was the real closure that no legal battle or divorce settlement could have provided. The acknowledgement that we were both more complex than victim or villain, that we had both been broken and both made bad choices, and both deserved a chance to become better. Today, 2 years after that terrible October night, I wake up in my modest apartment and make strong black coffee exactly how I like it. There's no one else to consider, no preference to accommodate, no eggshells to navigate. It's just me and my choices and the consequences I'm living with. I still have student loans I'll be paying for the next 10 years. I still drive a car with 160,000 miles on it. My furniture is a mix of IKEA and thrift store finds. But when I look around this space, I see something I didn't see for years in my marriage. Complete authenticity. Every item here I chose. Every decision reflects my real values, not values performed to impress someone or accommodate someone else's expectations. My social life exists entirely on my own terms now. Sunday brunches with Claire where we talk for hours about everything and nothing. Occasional pottery classes on Wednesday nights. still learning to create beauty from raw clay. Coffee dates with old friends I had neglected during my marriage. And yes, some disastrous first dates with men I met through apps, each one teaching me more about what I really need in a partner versus what I thought I wanted at 25. I'm not in a hurry. For the first time in my adult life, I'm comfortable being alone, which feels like a prerequisite for eventually being with someone healthily. The work I do now fills something in me that teaching, for all its value, never completely filled. When I help a couple navigate a moment of crisis without silencing each other, without using each other's vulnerability as a weapon, without turning justified hurt into a destruction campaign, I feel like I'm making small restitution for my own mistakes. I can't undo what I did to Ryan during those 2 months. I can't erase the messages I deleted without reading, the calls I refused when he was begging for help, the strategic silencing I used as a punishment tool. But I can use that experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. I keep a quote on my office wall, something Dr. Chen told me during one of our early sessions that has never left me. The pain you lived through can become poison you spread, or it can become medicine you offer. The choice is always yours. I look at that quote every morning before my first client, reminding myself that who I became during those 2 months of revenge doesn't have to define who I am now. People can change. People can do terrible things and then choose to do better. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it proves you're capable of learning from it. If I could go back and do it differently, would I? It's complicated. I still think leaving that marriage was the right choice. Ryan and I were slowly killing each other, and that terrible night just accelerated the inevitable. But the methods I used, the silencing, the calculated revenge, the refusal of context, those I would change in a heartbeat. I would have read the messages. I would have given him 5 minutes to explain about his father. I would have recognized that someone can hurt you deeply and still deserve basic compassion when they're collapsing. Those two truths could coexist, and my refusal to let them cause damage I can't completely repair. But here's what I learned, and what I share with every client who sits in my office chair carrying their own version of pain and anger. You can be right about needing to leave and wrong about how you leave. You can be the victim of real cruelty and still be responsible for your own choices of how to respond. Relationships rarely have a clear villain, usually just hurt people making bad choices, each convinced of their own righteousness, both contributing to a cycle of hurt that eventually consumes everything. And the only way to break that cycle is someone choosing compassion even when anger seems more justified. If you're reading this, if you're living your own version of this story, whether as the person who said cruel words or the person who received them, I want you to know some things. First, your pain is valid, whichever side you're on. Feeling hurt doesn't require justification or perfect innocence. You can have contributed to problems and still feel genuine pain about how things ended. Second, revenge won't heal that pain. It will feel satisfying while you're planning it, but the actual execution will cost you pieces of yourself you can't get back. And third, you have more power than you think to choose how this story ends. I won't lie and say choosing compassion over revenge is easy. It's not. It's agonizingly difficult to give grace to someone who hurt you when every fiber of your being wants to hurt them back. But here's the truth. It took 2 years of intensive therapy for me to really internalize. When you choose revenge, you're chaining yourself to the person who hurt you indefinitely. Every strategic action you take, every punishment method you employ, every form of silencing or manipulation you use, all of it keeps you trapped in that moment of original hurt, unable to move forward because you're too busy engineering retribution. Real peace, the kind I have now, sitting in my small office helping others find their way through their own darkness. That peace only came when I finally released my need for Ryan to pay for what he said. Yes, his words hurt me. Yes, our marriage was dying before that night. Yes, he contributed to that death in ways he has to live with. But my contribution, the systematic silencing, the calculated revenge, the refusal to listen when he was begging for help, that was also a choice. And I have to live with that too. And oddly, accepting my own imperfection, my own capacity for cruelty when I feel justified, freed me in ways that winning the legal battle never would have. So if you're where I was that terrible October, hurt and angry and planning meticulous retribution, I'm begging you, pause. Just for a moment, pause and consider what you really want on the other side of this. Do you want justice or do you want peace? Because often, you can't have both. Justice looks like revenge wrapped in legal language. Peace looks like releasing your need to punish perfectly. And only one of those will leave you able to sleep at night without the weight of knowing you turned someone's worst moment into your strategic opportunity. If I could make it through to the other side, if I could transform the worst version of myself into someone who now helps others avoid those same mistakes, then you can too. The door is there. You just need the courage to choose compassion over retribution, even when every part of you is screaming that revenge would be sweeter. Trust me, it wouldn't be. The sweetness only lasts until you have to look in the mirror and recognize who you became to get it. And that recognition, that cost to your own soul, there's no divorce settlement rich enough to be worth that.